What is happening, everyone? It's your boy Manny, and welcome back to episode 29 of Manny's Food Channel. For today's episode, I'm going to be making a dish that is bulk season worthy. It's one of those dishes where I'm sure brings us a lot of great memories, whether we had it from mom's version or to a restaurant version. We've all had a great memory of this dish growing up. So for today's episode, I'm going to be making spaghetti and meatballs. So this recipe here is extremely versatile. You can change the protein from beef to pork, from lamb to chicken if you want it a little bit more lean. You can add extra cheese, some cream, or even butter to add some shine and creaminess to the sauce. Or you can even throw in extra chili flakes if you want to make it a little bit more spicy. You can change the ingredients, move them around to make the version your own, and recreate that fond memory of the delicious spaghetti and meatball that we all grew up with. So without further ado, time to get cooking. So we're going to start off with preparing the ingredients for the meatball. I'm just going to finely dice some shallots. Next up, I'm going to grate some garlic. So next up, I'm going to chiffonade some flat leaf parsley. Just grab a bunch, roll it into a shape of a cigar, and just thinly slice or chiffonade the flat leaf parsley. And you only want to go through it once, you don't want to go through it multiple times because you want the flavor to stay in the parsley. You don't want to bruise it so that all the flavor is left on the board. So with this recipe, you can kind of put your own twist and variation on how you like to make spaghetti meatballs. The recipe I'm going with here today is I'm going to use 50% beef, 50% pork. But if you don't like pork or you don't eat pork, you can swap that out with just beef, or you can use chicken or ground lamb as well. And the great thing with these kind of recipes is you can kind of put your own ingredients, herbs, vegetables, anything that you like into your meatballs to kind of jazz it up and make it taste more delicious. But for this recipe here, just for simplicity purposes, I'm going to use a little bit of shallots, some garlic. So I'm going to just finish chopping up these flat leaf parsley here. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use 50% beef, 50% pork. Both of them are lean meat. I don't like to go with regular meat, which is usually a ratio of 40% fat, 60% meat. Here I have around 30% fat and 70% meat. I don't like it to be too oily, too greasy, and just kind of overall ruin the flavor of the meatball. So in order to put it all together, I'm going to start by pouring in some breadcrumbs. You can use any kind of breadcrumbs you have at home. Next, I'm going to toss in the garlic as well as the shallots. I'm going to throw in the flat leaf parsley. I like to use a lot of fresh herbs when it comes to making spaghetti and meatballs because it just lifts it to another dimension and provides a depth of freshness that you would normally get with dry herbs. And finally, I'm going to add in some grated Parmesan cheese. Now, before you season it, because Parmesan naturally is already salty, maybe fry off a piece before you completely season your meatball. You don't want to put the Parmesan, then season it with salt and cook a piece off to realize that it's become too salty. So I'm going to grate some Parmesan in here. I'm going to put a little bit of black pepper. And I'm just going to fry one off in the background to make sure that my seasoning is right before I continue on to add some salt and season the meatball. And now I'm just going to give this a real nice mix. You don't want to overmix it. Mix it just enough that you incorporate all the ingredients together. Some people like to put egg. I personally don't like to put egg in there because for me it kind of feels a little bit spongy and I want the meatball to taste and have a natural texture of meatball. So I'm not going to add an egg, but if you feel that you need to add an egg to kind of bind it together, or you like to add an egg, you can certainly add that in. So I'm just going to give this a real nice mix. So I fried a piece off in the background, and it definitely needs some salt. So now I'm just going to toss in some salt, mix in the salt, and then we can start to shape it into the desired size meatballs that we're looking for. Now before we roll the meatballs, I have a bowl of cold water here. It's just because I don't want it to stick to my hands, or I don't want the temperature of my hands to kind of melt the fat that's in the meatball. So think about the size and the shape that you want to make your meatballs in. Per serving, what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to serve around 3 meatballs per serving. So I'm just going to shape them into a nicely sized meatball. Not too big, not too small. One that I know 3 perfect sizes is good for 1 portion. And once I'm done rolling it, just place it on your plate or your tray and continue to roll them until all your meatballs are all rolled out. So now we're going to move on to the tomato sauce. Typically in spaghetti and meatballs, or whenever you're making some kind of marinara sauce, you remove the skin from the tomatoes by just cutting an X at the bottom and kind of blanching them for about 30 seconds to a minute to remove that skin. But because this is going to be quick and easy and we're going to be putting it through a blender to kind of make it as smooth as possible, I'm not going to remove the skin. So I have around 20 Roma tomatoes here, and what I'm going to do is just medium dice all my tomatoes first. Once you're done chopping up the tomatoes, medium dice 2 onions. Now the last little bit of business before we start putting this all together is we're going to grate some garlic. I'm going to grate around 10 cloves of garlic, which is close to 1 bulb of garlic. If you like a lot of garlic like I do, you should certainly add more garlic in there. But for this recipe, I'm only going to add around 10. So now we can start to put the tomato sauce together for the spaghetti and meatballs. But first what I'm going to do is I'm going to caramelize just the outside of the meatballs. We want to add some of that caramelization on the outside to add some flavor to the meatballs. We don't want to just boil it. So I'm going to add a touch of canola oil. That's just going to coat the bottom of this pan here. And you don't want to crowd the pan too much. You want to place just enough meatballs so that there's some space for any of the water to evaporate as we're just caramelizing the outside of the meatballs. So I'm just going to test one to make sure that the oil is hot enough. Once you hear that sizzle, you know it's hot enough. You can start putting the meatballs in the pan. I'm probably going to put 5 in this one here. So once you caramelized all the outside of the meatball, or all the surfaces, just remove it from the pan and put it on a plate, and then continue to fry off the rest of the meatballs until you've caramelized all of your meatballs. So once we've caramelized all of our meatballs, we're going to set them aside. And we're going to cook our tomato sauce in the same pan. We want to utilize all that caramelization and all that flavor that's in the bottom of the pan. We don't want to throw it away because there's a lot of flavor and will contribute a lot of flavor to the tomato sauce. So first, I'm going to add in some extra virgin olive oil. Because I added canola oil in the beginning, the olive oil won't burn. So I turn the heat down just a touch. I'm going to spread the olive oil all the way around. And now I'm going to sweat off the onions until they turn translucent. If you have a look here, notice at the bottom of my pan, all that caramelization has been mixed in with the onions. You notice that it's not stuck or it's burnt at the bottom. And that's what you want. Lots of flavor incorporated into your tomato sauce. And then once you see that the onions are translucent, you can move on to adding your garlic. So I'm going to cook up the garlic for probably around 5 minutes, making sure that I constantly stir the garlic so that way it doesn't burn. And in the meantime, I'm also going to toss in a couple bay leaves, some chili flakes. I want to extract some of that chili flavor into the onions. Depending on how spicy you like it, you can add more or less of the chili flakes. And I'm going to cook it for 5 minutes until all of the garlic is cooked. So once you cooked off the onions, I'm just going to toss in a little bit of salt and a little bit of black pepper just to season the onions. So a touch of salt, some pepper, and now we can add in the tomatoes. So just gently add in the tomatoes, and I'm going to bring this up to a simmer, cover it up with a lid, and cook it down all the way, so probably around 45 minutes to an hour, slow and gently until it turns into close to a puree consistency, so that we can put it in a blender and blend it up. And in the meantime, as we wait for this to kind of cook down, we can move on to make the spaghetti. So to make the spaghetti, it's extremely simple. I have a pot that's at a rolling boil. I'm going to make the water ocean salty, so extremely salty. Give it a decent stir. Next up, I'm just going to toss in a drizzle of olive oil, just to help the pasta not stick together. And then now I'm going to toss in the spaghetti. Now be careful, you want to make sure that you cook your spaghetti to al dente, which is to the bite. So as you're taking a bite, it's got a bit of a crunch, but to the point that the pasta is still cooked. And once you toss it into the water, just grab your tongs and slowly twist the rest of the spaghetti into the water and boil it for around 6 to 7 minutes, or until the pasta is at an al dente. And then I'm going to strain the spaghetti, run it under cold water just to cool it down very quickly, and just mix it in with a touch more of olive oil, and then we'll set it aside. So once the tomato sauce is cooked, make sure to remove the bay leaf first. And if you have to do it in batches, do it in batches. But start transferring the tomato puree into your blender. And you want to be careful during this step because it's extremely hot. And you don't want to put too much in your blender at the same time. I would probably fill around half. Fill it at the halfway mark. And make sure you have a towel on top of your blender so that as you're blending, in case it splashes back, it doesn't burn your hand. And make sure you do it while it's hot. That way you get a really nice consistency for your tomato sauce. So once you pureed your tomato sauce, you can dump it back in to the same pot, and then we'll start to season it, add the meatballs and cook it up. So I just reheated the sauce. Now we're going to start to season it. So I'm going to start by adding in some basil, some nicely chiffonade basil. Next up, I'm going to toss in a lot of Parmesan. Now again, Parmesan is salty, so before you add in more salt, have a taste. Make sure that it isn't too salty. If you need to add more salt, then add in more salt. I'm going to toss in a little bit of black pepper. Next, I'm going to throw in some oregano. If you like oregano, then you can throw in a lot, but I won't throw in too much. And then finally, we're going to add in some balsamic vinegar. Now, if you feel that your tomato sauce is a little bit more on the acidic side, you can add some sugar in, which I'm going to do in a little bit here. I'm just going to let it reduce. And just to counterbalance the sourness of your sauce, you can add in some sugar. That way it balances out the flavor really nicely. So now I'm just going to fold in all these ingredients and let it simmer lightly for at least 5 to 10 minutes until all these ingredients are well incorporated. We're going to have a taste. If we need to season it some more, I'm going to season it some more. Otherwise, I'm going to toss in the meatballs and cook the meatballs inside the tomato sauce before we can go ahead and start plating. So this step is completely optional. If you like your tomato sauce to be a little bit rich, then toss in a couple knobs of butter. That way it gives a nice gloss, nice shine, and a touch of richness to finish it off. So I'm just going to give this a nice mix. And then now we're going to add in the meatballs. Cover with a lid, cook it off, and then start plating. Now normally I would give a spiel about the dish that I created that day, but I ain't got no time. I'm extremely hungry and I want to try out this dish. So without further ado, time for the taste test. Cheers. The meatball is extremely moist, and that touch of sugar that we added inside the tomato sauce counterbalanced that tartness and the sourness that came from the tomatoes, and it's absolutely delicious. So have a try, let me know how it is, and if you enjoyed the video, please give the video a thumbs up. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing everyone next time.